Cool. All right, so we'll kick off around about now. Well, welcome again to episode 2 of the webinar series by Insider Guides. Thank you again, for joining us. And these webinars are a weekly series that we're doing, and they'll be focused on, I guess, practical optimism within the international education sector during this coronavirus pandemic. And it doesn't feel like too long ago we were calling it an endemic, and just something that was happening in one country, but now it seems to have been affected all corners of the globe, and here we are. So my name is James Martin. I am the Managing Director of Insider Guides. We create guides and online content to prepare, welcome and support international students in Australia, and we also help organisations promote their brand to international students at various stages of their journey. And recently we've also been creating custom content and white label student focused content for organisations for use in their own channels, which has been pretty cool. Part of what we used to do in the old days is bring the sector together through networking events around Australia and share best practice with guest speakers. Peter's one of our guests today has actually been one of those guest speakers, but as those events are well and truly off the table, I just wanted to, we thought we'd better move to webinars quite quickly, and I want to thank you all for taking the time to log on. So at Insider Guides, we will keep producing and curating content throughout the COVID-19 crisis to ensure international students have the best information at hand. We'll also continue to do our weekly webinars to keep this conversation going in the sector and sharing positive stories and challenges and just really create some practical optimism, as I was saying before. So next week we have Robert Chassis from Sonder and a representative from Scape Student Living, who will be talking about accommodation and mental health and how international students are coping and what can we do to better support them as individuals going through this really tough time. And talk about how the accommodation sector has also responded, which is has been affected as well. So this is a Q&A format in this webinar. You can ask questions using the Q&A function in your screen, and we will try to get to them. Obviously, it's not easy. Last week we had about 50 questions and we answered about 10. It's not easy, and some questions we just don't know the answer to. So I apologize in advance if we can't get to them all. So I'd like to introduce our speakers for today, our guests. So here we have Tom Gifford, who is the Assistant Director of International Recruitment within the Global Marketing, Digital and Student Recruitment portfolio at RMIT University. He leads the international recruitment team that is responsible for marketing, recruitment, business development and student mobility, and provides high-level strategic advice to senior management and university stakeholders on all aspects of international student recruitment and international student marketing. Tom is also currently leading RMIT's domestic student recruitment team. We also have Peter Mackey, who joined the International Trade and Investment team in New South Wales as a director in October 2014 after 7 years with Austrade. Prior to this, he was the Trade Commissioner to Hanoi in 2010 and then Singapore. During this time, he also held a regional role as Education Commissioner, ASEAN, and leading Austrade's regional education team across Southeast Asia. Over the past 20 years, Peter has worked primarily in the education and training, ICT and government sectors. In his current role, Peter oversees the Study New South Wales team, the small business operations team, as well as the export team based in Sydney, and the broader Trade Start network of advisors around regional New South Wales. Thank you so much both for joining me today.
Thanks, James.
Cool. Look, it's been a tough few weeks, and as I mentioned last Wednesday, students are really struggling and the sector is adapting quickly to changing circumstances and doing what it can to support both their onshore and offshore students. In the sector, over the past few days, our colleagues who I've worked with for years are closing up shop, and there is just so much uncertainty about the future. But there is also examples of practical optimism that I'm seeing around, and we do need to celebrate and share these stories. And while today we're talking about universities and government, I do want to acknowledge that students, of course, are suffering, but also the vet and ELICOS sector in particular is being really hit hard by this. At the end of this webinar, you will be directed to a post-event survey. And if your question wasn't answered today and you'd be interested in keeping a future discussion going, please let us know and we'll get going and we'll keep the conversation going. So this is a discussion. Please do feel free to ask questions, and Tom and Peter and myself will try to answer during the chat as well. So let's get started. Tom, could you give us an insight into what COVID-19 means for RMIT and universities around Australia? How have your team reacted over the past 30 days?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, James. I guess I'll just start off by saying that 2020 has been a really challenging year so far. We're just into April, but even back in January, we had the bushfires, which I know from a recruitment perspective caused a lot of concerns for prospective students. And now we're working through the current crisis. And I guess even when I look back, 8 to 10 weeks ago, I think many of us were feeling pretty optimistic about 2020. So it just shows in the industry that we're in how quickly things can change. And I guess when we're talking about coronavirus or COVID-19, I guess the caveat that I speak to is that this is evolving so quickly that at RMIT we've had to change how we respond to this crisis, pretty much on a daily basis. And from the university's perspective, obviously the recruitment team are really at the centre of how we respond, but it's amazing to see how a big institution can come together, and you actually really start to see all of the work that's done behind the scenes. So around timetabling, around property services, around student support. So I think when you're talking about optimism and positive stories, I think it does give institutions an opportunity to really learn who does what at the university. And I guess as well, there's been a massive amount, something else that's optimistic, there's been a massive amount of work done by institutions, by government, by agents, and many others as well. And I think today and other forums is really reassuring when you're kind of at the centre of it in terms of getting that support from a personal perspective. I guess talking about our response over the last 30 days, I guess, as I said, things are changing very, very quickly. And I guess the whole crisis for us started off, where we had essentially students that were mainly in China that were unable to travel, and they were both commencing and continuing students, and they were unable to travel for an amount of time for semester one. And at that point, RMIT was really focused on, okay, what care can we offer those students in the short term? And what can we offer them in terms of online learning as well? And again, a large number of stakeholders from an internal perspective in terms of making sure that would happen. And then, as a recruitment team, our core function is recruitment. So it was also essentially ripping up our tactics for the remainder of the year and looking at new initiatives that we had to focus on. And again, at that point, very focused on how we could have an impact for semester two. Obviously, that's even starting to change in that there's travel bans in place, there's full lockdowns in a number of our large markets. There's also other issues. So we know that international qualifications, there'll be changes in the way that they're issued this year. So the way that we've been responding has been, a lot of it from a policy perspective internally, a compliance perspective, and obviously a recruitment perspective, but also working closely with our colleagues in government in terms of changes that we know will impact the way that particularly this year looks for us. And I guess ultimately the change has moved from how do we get students through a short-term travel restriction to now, it's quite different and there's probably more uncertainty. So it's from a pure recruitment perspective, it's about reassuring our students and agents that we're here, we're available, and making sure that we continue to build a pipeline for the months and years ahead.
Okay.
And again, looking at different ways that we can do that.
Yeah, we're just noticing a few questions come in about RMIT and what they're doing to retain current students and things like that. So we will get to those questions. I'll answer that one live with Tom later. Peter, from a Study New South Wales perspective, obviously you're in a bit of a different position working in state government. I'd love to hear a bit of a timeline of what's happened to you over the past 30 days and give us an insight into the world of government.
Yeah, thanks, James. I mean, it's when you reflect on it, it's kind of hard, I think, for all of us to really keep up. As Tom said, it's just been such a moving target. I should also say I've got a few different hats. I'm on the board of IEAA. I'm also was asked to be on that global the task force for the Global Reputation Task Force that Phil Honeywood's running, and I'm also a board member of the Student Accommodation Association. So each of those prisms, I guess, has impacted me in this work because they've all had significant impacts on those different areas of student life. And we think back to the devastation of the bushfires, and the federal government thought it important enough to set up a task force, and then very, very quickly COVID-19 got added to the terms of reference, and it really, notwithstanding the complete devastation of the bushfires, it's almost like that has just completely overwhelmed and overshadowed it. I think the problem is, as Tom pointed out, that the situation has changed so rapidly. It's been a case of trying to keep up, and governments, are not great at being nimble and agile and shifting. And when something changes on a daily basis, it means that your strategy and your policy response that you've put in place and sought approval for is all of a sudden irrelevant because the paradigm has shifted completely in a matter of hours and a day. So that's been a problem for us. So looking back, as Tom mentioned, initially this was an issue impacting Chinese students. Our focus was working with the Chinese consulate, with Chinese students here, with our partners in China, getting information to Chinese students. And then obviously the situation rapidly evolved from there. So part of the problem is we're in such an unprecedented situation. It's really hard to know how to act. I think our approach in the first instance was simply about trying to get information out because there was so much information overload coming from so many different angles. We were trying to qualify that and decide, what information do international students here and offshore need to get. So that was our sort of initial focus. In more recent times, it's been about advocacy primarily, identifying what the issues are as they've emerged. And again, those issues, as I said, have changed almost on a daily basis. To the point that we're now down to the sort of food and shelter and a very basic sort of Maslow's pyramid issues of survival, and trying to advocate to our individual state governments and federal government around what those things are, and trying to have an influence on those. So what we're now in the phase of doing is trying to interpret some of the policy decisions that are coming from the federal government, the state government, making sure students understand what apply to them, what don't, what are the gaps, what can we do collectively, not only as a state government here in New South Wales, but I guess more importantly across the country, join up with our counterparts in other states and territories and the federal government, because really it's the reputation of the country on the line here. We need to respond. International students have been part of our success. We now need to be with them in their hour of need, and how we act now will determine how we're judged into the future. So it's a really critical time, I think. And I might just pause there, and we can.
Yeah, I know, and I'd love to hear a little bit more a bit later on about how you have been working with the other study bodies, because it wasn't that long ago they didn't work together all that well. Look, let's sort of jump forward a little bit to the current students and the ones that are currently here in Australia. And last week we spoke to Rebecca Hall from Austrade, who mentioned that international education is a unique export industry, in that once you stop it, the product is still in the country. And in that case, students are often in a very difficult position. They've got no family or social network or no institution to go to now, really, and many have now lost their part-time job and severely limited in their options when moving forward. So I'd love to, Tom, from your perspective, from an RMIT perspective, in light of these in these travel bans as well, there's a commercial reality now around retention of current students and ensuring they don't leave. And I'm sure we have a lot of people on the line from universities who would love to hear what RMIT has done in terms of trying to retain them.
Sure. Yeah, I'd just like to also respond to Peter's comment about how we respond now is how we're judged. I think that's really important, because international education has been a successful industry for a number of years. So I guess at RMIT, all of the conversations have been about that advocacy piece for the student, and how are we supporting our new and continuing students in a really difficult period. I guess as well, in terms of answering your question, I guess a real challenge for us ultimately is that we know that when students are coming to study at our institutions, yes, they're choosing the course and the program, but they're also making decisions around which city they want to study in, which institution, and also which country they want to study in. And essentially there are drivers around essentially being globally mobile and having that lived experience. So I guess at the forefront of RMIT's mind is that essentially the experience that these students signed up to is quite different to what they're experiencing now. And I guess I'll talk briefly about some short-term initiatives and then some thinking in terms of the long term. But I guess there's lots of different approaches that universities are taking. And obviously, like every institution, RMIT, we do a lot of competitor watching in terms of, how are people responding to this? And there's obviously short-term initiatives that we look at, things like census date, moving census dates, so that students can actually genuinely try online before they're committing financially. So I think that's a key one. But again, I think something that we've focused really heavily on is how do we genuinely create a community for students when, as you said, they're here. Often they haven't got family, they might not have friends, they might be in isolation. So how do we actually provide them with that, digital community? So from an academic perspective, so a lot of work's been done to create, really important connection points for students. So things like weekly videos to recap, online collaboration tools and forums for students, online drop-in sessions, learning activities with loops built into them, so that students have that constant feedback and support. And then something else we've looked at is creating, more of a, outside of the academic piece, looking at creating a digital community, essentially to replace some of those lack of connections that they may feel in the current scenario. But we're really conscious that retention it's going to be a real long-term challenge, I think. There's a lot of work that the universities are doing now in terms of creating those digital communities. But as you touched upon, James, I think there's longer-term issues of mental health that we need to work on to make sure students are supported. Also, we're conscious that again, one of the drivers of students coming to Australia is that opportunity to work part-time while they're here. Obviously, that's a real challenge at the moment. And we know that students have concerns about their families. RMIT is doing a lot in the short term in terms of particularly around that building of a community. But I think as well, we've got to all make sure that we've got an eye on the longer term challenge as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I've been on some of the forums just before this webinar. I was having a look at what students are saying, and a lot of them are asking these questions. I'm meant to be coming? Am I still allowed to come? But then there's other ones that are already here, and they're a little bit angry that they can't actually get to their institution, and they're asking questions like, can I what should I do? And there are other students feeding back things, saying things like, oh, just try and get on the next plane and leave. And I'm like, it must be so hard to control the narrative from a university perspective, because these students are looking for answers in all corners of the internet. Yeah, and I can just imagine the challenge. And Peter, I'd love to bring you in here, because on a broader perspective, you've got initiatives that you had planned to really support international students and create that sense of community. Things like, but they're all based around people. They're all based around networking, awards and employment and seminars and things like that, which are now basically impossible. So with that in mind, how are you addressing the needs of current students, and how have you had to shift your priorities and goalposts?
Yeah, well, I mean, we have to completely rethink how we deliver all of our services, James, for at least the next 6 months. Before I dive into that, I just might be worth reflecting on some of the stuff that we've done. I think what we wanted to do was get a handle on pretty quickly what is actually going on out there. So last week we put out a survey. It had a reach of around about just under 60,000. We got around 700 responses. 92% of those responses were from international students, which was exactly what we were hoping for. And I mean, you won't be surprised at the kinds of responses, but just reflecting on some of those, because it did help to reinforce what we understood were the issues. So overwhelming request was for financial assistance from wherever they could get it, state, federal, governments, institutions, whatever. Many students confirmed that they are in severe rental stress and also struggling to pay course fees. Some indicated they haven't got money for food, which again was something that we suspected. And all people sort of asking for some kind of assistance in trying to find work or accessing a superannuation. And then, as Tom touched on, calls for additional support services in the mental health and also advice on visa extension, etc. We also had feedback from a significant proportion of agents who reflected a lot of those sentiments, but also strongly asking us to advocate to Commonwealth Government around welfare and visa. Temporary visa holders having access to some of the welfare packages that have been announced. And there have been a number of policy decisions announced. So as I said before, we're trying to sort of, I guess, work out which ones apply to international students, which don't. The work that was done in the rental space was great, but we do know from our own free legal service that we offer here in New South Wales, delivered by the Redfern Legal Centre, that there are student illegal evictions happening. So we're trying to sort of get that information out. So in the first instance, we've just tried to wade through all of that and get the information about what support services are available from either federal or state government. Yesterday, we put up our International Student Welfare Hub on our website, study.sydney. So that's basically looking at trying to just dissect what support services are there available for international students across accommodation, housing, government services and support, emergency food assistance, what sort of charities, non-government organisations they can tap into, what mental health and wellbeing services are there, how to find out about all those immigration questions, and then getting free legal advice here in New South Wales, as well as how to get in touch with their embassies if they need to, and what the education providers are doing here in New South Wales. So I think we're in this sort of period now where everyone's just trying to understand what the ramifications of these decisions are for them, and then work out what action they need to take. And so I think we're still in this, what you might call the emergency phase, James, where we're just trying to dissect and understand how many students, and that's the thing we don't actually really know. You mentioned earlier about the ELICOS and vet sectors. Well, we know the ELICOS sector has been decimated. We know the private provider sector has been decimated. And so, there's clearly very large cohorts of students across the country that have been impacted by that, who may have lost their job, who may be now out of home. So I think in this first phase, it's really about that immediate response. So we're talking with our counterparts in other states and territories around, what we can do in that food space with groups like Food Bank and others. We're talking to the purpose-built student accommodation sector around the potential for establishing some kind of crisis accommodation for those students that fall in between the gaps. And we're also talking, within our own jurisdictions about how we can get additional funding to put towards some of those support wraparound services,
Right.
such as legal and mental health. So that's kind of, I suppose, in the first instance, and then down the track, it's about, okay, well, all of the things that we had planned to do that are still relevant, keeping students engaged, giving them opportunities to find out how to develop their employability skills, which are all going to be important over this time. We've, as you said, essentially got to shift those from an online, from a face-to-face delivery model to an online sort of virtual distance delivery model.
Yeah, right. And that will be the challenge moving online. And I'd love to hear from Tom in 1 second. We just had a couple of questions here about the Study New South Wales survey. Is that the results can be shared on that, or is that a private thing for you guys?
No, happy to share those. So I can take that as an action and get you a sort of high-level results from that. But essentially, it's sort of pretty much what I've covered off there. Yeah.
No worries. That's 2 questions answered. We're getting through them bit by bit. Tom, Peter mentioned about moving online and having to do that. Obviously, you're in that situation where that is the product that people are buying, and you're now having to grapple with that, getting a huge amount of content online. I'd love to hear about how that experience has been at a university in terms of getting that content online in what is about 2 weeks, 3 weeks.
Yeah. So that's obviously been a massive job. I guess in some ways RMIT was in a fortunate position in some ways, in that there was a large number of courses that were already online. But RMIT offers a massive number of programs. So we've got over 500 programs that we offer to international students. So sometimes just the scale is a real challenge, and of course RMIT is multi-sector as well. So there's obviously additional challenges in terms of the vocational piece and those practical pieces. And I know that as that 2 or 3 week period got to a place where most of the courses are available online. There's obviously some courses that couldn't. And again, the next question that we then get asked regularly by students is, okay, how do the assessments work and how do the exams work? So you kind of solve, I know everyone's in the same boat, you solve one issue and then the next issue is, okay, what next in terms of the exam? So now that online piece is somewhat solved, then the next stage is, okay, how do we have real clarity, or how quickly can we get real clarity around things like online assessment and exams? I guess as well, just things that we focused on again are how do we make sure that whether you're onshore or offshore, because we know we've got students that are enrolled that are now in their home country or in Australia, that there's that flexibility around when they can access course content, when they can access lectures. We've had to work through issues around connection, particularly in certain countries. How can they access some of the platforms? And again, making sure that all of the staff within RMIT that are using new ways of teaching have adequate training and support, so that they can in turn offer that to students as well. I guess, again, I'm going to touch upon community. So again, that's been a big focus. So in terms of, yes, getting the courses online, but how do we make sure that there's that support service that kind of wraps around the academic teaching as well? So from a recruitment perspective, but also from a broader perspective, I know the British Council have done some reporting on this, but students like that peer-to-peer support. And in the absence of face-to-face, how do we make sure, or something that we focus on is how do we make sure that students still have those connections with existing international students. I guess drilling down a little bit in terms of from a recruitment perspective, so in terms of my team's core role, again, we've very much worked in a face-to-face industry for a number of years. We've often dabbled in virtual events and virtual fairs, but I guess this has given us the real impetus to really embrace and look really proactively at different platforms. So how do we engage with student in a broad sense, and then how do we service or work with our students in a more targeted or case management approach as well. So again, using online platforms and starting to engage more proactively with students, I guess, is the way that we've approached it. We certainly don't proclaim to have all of the best platforms and ways of doing things, but I guess if anyone's looking for advice, I would say that try not to overcomplicate things. For many recruiters, we're not as advanced as our marketing teams often in terms of the digital way, but it's been just getting things done essentially, and not just focusing on the basics in terms of how do we talk to students, how do we reach out to students, and how do we provide them with the content and the knowledge that they need. And again, I think from our perspective, it's how do we create more content that students can use and access during this current time, when their potential agent is closed, where there's less opportunities for them to interact with us face to face.
Yeah, and I guess, do you think though the sector is getting on the front foot here about moving online, or do you think they're sort of struggling a little bit?
I kind of think I think we're being forced into it. Even outside of our sector, there's reports on the news now about more and more people visiting their GP from a virtual perspective. I read something yesterday about they're looking at Formula One being delivered online. So I think this is really forcing us to embrace it. So yes, I think there's really promising signs, and I think it is making us think differently about how we do things, and I think it will eventually, or I think it's pushing us to a more proactive approach in terms of the way that we work with our agents, the way that we work directly with students. So I think the longer the crisis goes on, the more that we will be
forced into it.
And I think there'll be more appetite from students as well, because they're in a similar position where they'll be looking to interact with us in different ways.
Yeah, RMIT has 16,000 onshore international students, and 24% of your total student population are international students. It must be a huge challenge to make sure they're all getting a high standard at one time. I'd love to sort of move on a little bit to Peter. I mentioned a little bit earlier about how the study bodies, when I first started Insider Guides 10 years ago, the idea of a study body was a relatively new thing, and the state government getting involved with the support of international students in that grey area when a student would leave their accommodation, leave their institution. No one was really quite sure how a student should be looked after or supported, and I guess the study bodies popped up at that point, and then they also took on some promotion as well of the city as a destination. I'm just really curious to see how you're all working together, and this is fantastic to see it. I'm really loving the innovation, but I'd love to get maybe an anecdote. I think you mentioned one a little while ago yesterday about residential colleges and how you all work together to get that one going.
Yeah, thanks, James. And look, I have to say, I think it's actually in the beginning they started as promotional bodies. I think that was probably the evolution, and then by the time we were probably the last kid on the block, the last sort of to the party, and in some ways the sector in New South Wales sort of brought the government kicking and screaming to the table to establish it. And I think the government kind of thought, well, why would there be a need for this? And very early on, it was kind of clear that the role of Study New South Wales would not be about trying to promote students to come here. It was more about trying to make sure that the experience matched the brochure or the website, and in many cases it didn't. It's a lot of students come to New South Wales and Sydney in particular, but it's a global city, and there are lots of challenges, and so our role is more about working with the education providers in this state to plug the gap between the experience that they can control, which is on campus, and the experience that the students have when they leave campus. So I suppose it's staying in touch with what the pain points of that are. And look, I think over the time that I've been here, you're right. The Commonwealth, state and territories have really come together around this sector. We have a forum where we meet at least 4 times a year, but in reality, I'll pick up the phone to Shannon in Queensland, or Georgina in Melbourne, or Karen in South Australia, or Rebecca at Austrade regularly, and we'll call each other, text each other, and say, "Hey, have you heard this?" I think from our perspective, there's a very strong understanding that the world actually doesn't understand Australia's complicated federalism, and it doesn't really matter. That I don't think people know what New South Wales or Victoria or Queensland are. It's Australia, so we're very much focused on that. To that example that you gave, I mean, this is interesting with this National Cabinet meeting every couple of nights about this rapidly evolving situation. There's been tremendous concern around social distancing, of course, and I think the focus came on the purpose-built student accommodation sector, in particular the university colleges sector last week, and there was talk of maybe needing to shut that down. So we all got word of that. We all very rapidly got on the phone to each other. We started lobbying our chief medical officers and explaining that this would be a bad idea, because you'd actually be putting a whole bunch of students effectively onto the street who would then go into couch surfing. And, if the attempt was to try and control that, then you might be having the reverse effect. We got great leadership from Phil Honeywood at the head of the task force, who used his influences, and that was sort of and shut down very quickly as an issue. So that was a great example of everyone kind of working together, seeing how this is going to be a problem for the country, and I guess use the pincer movement, so to speak, to make sure that the right information. And look, the thing to be fair here, there's no disrespect to the health authorities. They're trying to understand the situation. I don't think there was an understanding of how sophisticated the purpose-built student accommodation sector is in Australia, and the huge efforts that they had already gone to. Because if you remember going back, this was a problem primarily impacting Chinese students, and they had students from Wuhan who had already come here. So they had to do self-isolation before self-isolation was a thing. So, they had all of those hygiene protocols in place, and once the various health bodies understood that, and in fact, touch wood, but we've not had major. In fact, I'm not even sure of any infections being recorded in that sector. So that was a good example of everyone kind of working together for the common good.
Yeah, it's the sector thanks you and for your efforts, and that was interesting, because I said last week as well that it's one of these situations where a lot of people don't really understand the role government has until something like this does occur, and then it's obviously how important you can really see very clearly how important that level of communication, that level of clarity, and that level of proactive behaviour really got a good outcome at the end. But it's something that I don't think a lot of people really understand how governments work together and how quickly they can move for the benefit of the people as well. And it's not easy, because governments aren't exactly lean.
There you go. Craig's from Scapes just confirmed 0 issues in PBSA, which is great, and I think testament to the measures that they're taking to mitigate the risk.
Yeah, and that's fantastic. I mean, even the residential accommodation, the residential colleges around Australia, I mean, they're well equipped to deal with isolation of students. They've got the rooms, they're all set up, they can control who goes in, who goes out. So you would have thought that would be a lot safer than pushing them into the community. So I'm glad you shut that one down. I'd love to hear a little bit. Well, maybe we should take a question. Yeah, let's have a look. So, Tom, we got a question about reducing course fees at RMIT. Obviously, if that's something that is still being discussed or not cannot be commented on, that's fine too. But just thought I'd throw it out there from Charlene Ellison.
Yeah. So RMIT's at this stage is not moving in that direction. I guess the big focus for us as a university has been what that support looks like in terms of the online piece. So how do we nurture our students through that online journey that they're on? So that's been the approach up to now. Things are always changing, but I think the university's fairly confident in what it's offering online. I know that there's work being done on I guess a package, but I guess we're really conscious at RMIT that there's a large number of students that may be impacted by this. So for domestic students as well. So we know that that there's domestic students that say share a house with a couple of students from overseas that haven't been able to get back in time. So we're just really conscious of making sure that any support that is offered is available to all. And again, really focusing on giving students that support through their journey, and also giving them some more time in terms of census date to really give the online learning an opportunity before they have to ultimately commit financially. So that's RMIT's approach.
Yeah, right. And it must be so difficult because obviously you have fixed costs that need to be to look after within a university itself. So I can only imagine. I mean, every business in Australia is now looking at their P&Ls and balance sheets of a bit of horror at the moment. So look, I'd love to speak a little bit about the initiatives that we have seen, some of the positives and positive initiatives. Just about an hour ago, I saw something on Facebook about the Victorian government launching a $500 million support package for Victorian workers, which is essentially reallocating the workers to different parts of the economy. If you're skilled in one area but no longer have a job, perhaps you can work and actually add value to the fight against COVID-19. And there's certain universities that have launched hardship funds, and such as UniSA have launched a $10 million hardship fund. And there's all sorts of things happening. I'd love to hear from you both. Peter, I'll start with you. Have you seen any initiatives across the sector that give you that sense of hope? And I guess we're going to hashtag it now, practical optimism.
Yeah, look, there's been a bunch of things. I think Victorian government had a great initiative early on too, in terms of offering food packages to students who had gone into self-isolation, and that kind of led to a discussion about how we could maybe expand that to where we're talking to any entities that have a national presence, rather than just sort of doing something in one location. Let's look at how we can sort of make that national. Again, going back to that sense that students not really knowing about jurisdictions and being agnostic as to where they are. So I think it seems now, I think the most important thing is to try and understand how many students are affected and where they are, and how to get in touch with those students. And there are a range of support services that students can access anyway, that not necessarily the recent policy decisions that federal or state governments have announced, but I think it's really making sure that we can direct the students to where they are. Because if you're born here, you might know about how to go and access some of those support services, but if you're not, you really need to understand very quickly how to do that. So I think we're speaking with our counterparts in the federal government around some of the areas in terms of work. I know that the Home Affairs, it was great. They got on really quickly and relaxed measures in terms of work rights in some of those specific sectors, such as aged care and retail. We've been lobbying them. So, for example, certain initiatives announced through the stimulus packages at the state government level here has meant there's been increased demand in particular sectors, such as cleaning and others, agriculture. So we're lobbying through our federal colleagues to Home Affairs and so on to see if we can broaden those relaxation measures, because it's going to be really important that we try and get those students who are now out of work back into work, particularly as now we know that job keeper program won't apply to them. And at the same time, making sure that we're giving them access to the sort of support services they need, not only in terms of those basic human rights around food and shelter, but also in terms of those wraparound services for legal and mental health, etc. We were in touch with our free legal service earlier in the week, and unfortunately, business is booming for them. Normally, obviously, they're overwhelmed, but they're particularly overwhelmed at the moment, and it's really helping them with some of those basic understanding of their rights, particularly with the large number of students that are living out in the private rental accommodation, understanding that they can't be evicted, and making sure that they know that they can go and approach police and others if they're being threatened. So I think really, James, it's about, like I said, understanding who that cohort is and where they are and how we can reach them.
Yeah, okay, because it must be quite difficult. We did have a question here about the task force. I'm not sure if you can answer this, but Marianne Sau has asked if the task force has discussed how it can support international students not in PBSAs, multiple issues including the ability to pay rent, lack of internet access, living alone, things like that. Has there been any discussion at that level, or can you even talk about that?
I think at the task force, it's sort of, that's more down at the weeds level, which we're trying to deal with maybe at the state and territory level. I mean, I think those federal decisions, policy decisions many of them are then being implemented and I guess interpreted and put into effect by the state governments. So what we're doing is, in the case of the rental situation, we're making sure that all of the authorities here understand the vulnerability and the large numbers of students that are in that sector, and the overwhelming majority are out in private rental. As I said, through our free legal service, just making sure that students know how to contact them to get advice if they are threatened. So it's probably not so much a thing at the task force level, which is really, there's so many things happening and you've got so many different agencies involved. It's critical that they focus on those really high level things, and we're probably more down at that weeds level.
Yeah, right. Tom, do you have anything you'd like to mention about some of the initiatives that you've seen across the Victorian, or just around Australia in terms of universities, things like that?
Yeah, so I guess that's something that, particularly as this crisis is changing so quickly, for us, it's been really reassuring to see other resources that as a university we can tap into as well. So even the Austrade In This Together campaign was something that we felt was so important for the market at that time. We also know Study Melbourne have got a resource pack for students as well. And I think that's really positive in terms of helping bring institutions together rather than seeing each other as competition as such. I know that I've seen a couple of really strong campaigns that I've seen over the last couple of days. I know there's one university that's run a crowdsourcing campaign amongst their staff and alumni to create a hardship fund for their international students. So I thought that was a really nice way for alumni and staff to give back to some of those students. And I've also seen Study Adelaide have done some nice stuff around that building community as well. I think they've organised kind of Netflix sessions where their students can log in and watch a movie together and chat. So I think there's been some great initiatives to look at. And then I guess from RMIT's perspective, in terms of how we've responded, so I guess for us, we've obviously got campuses in Vietnam, we've got delivery offshore as well. So we've had to really look at, the needs of the specific cohort. So rather than a blanket approach, I had to try and really look at which students are where and what support they need. And as a university, we're still working on what that package looks like. again, at the moment, the broader focus has been on helping in terms of build that community support for students.
For sure. And I think I'd just like to sort of skip forward to, well, next week we're talking to Scape, which is awesome. I can't wait for that. But Peter, as you sit on the board of the Student Accommodation Association, can you tell us a little bit about how that sector is coping? And I'd just love to get a couple of insights into where you see the red flags might be, just in case the viewers now might tune in next week.
Yeah, look, and I should say I'm obviously not an expert in that sector. My role on that board is, I guess, representing state governments and trying to pick up on some of the key areas of advocacy and how we can support those, not only here in New South Wales, but through our counterparts in other states and at the federal level. Look, I think they've adapted really well for how we've been working with the sector here in New South Wales. It has been very much around trying to liaise with our health department around what their protocols and their requirements are. As the social isolation and the distancing and the all of those sorts of protocols came into place, there was lots of grey areas, and as I said, I think there probably wasn't a sophisticated understanding of the complexity of that sector. So we had to sort of demystify that and sort of break down a few barriers, and then work as an intermediary between health and the sector to make sure that they understood, if a student needs to go into isolation and they're in a 4-bedroom apartment, what does that mean in terms of bathrooms? Those sort of tin-tack questions that were really important for them to understand. Jeff Dennison, the head of the Student Accommodation Association, is represented on the task force. So he's been very vocal in terms of making sure that the accommodation sector, their views are sort of represented at that level, which has been great. And it's again, going back to sort of the Maslow's pyramid of needs analogy, there's nothing more basic in terms of a human right than your shelter. So if we haven't got that right, then nothing else is going to work. So I think it's one of the positives of this crisis has been just bringing into stark relief what the needs of students are and where we need to focus our attention. And it's also meant that we've kind of come together more as a group nationally to make sure that we're raising the importance of these issues of people who are making decisions.
Yeah, I agree. I think I think the managed student accommodation and whether it's residential or PBSA, I think this will be the time. Well, my own opinion is I think this will be the time where they show unbelievable value in the time of a crisis because of the care that they can provide, as well as homestay, as well as it's I think the most dangerous thing is just send students out to a private rental, and I think that's not an easy situation to be in. Tom, I've got a lot of questions over the past week I've talked to about 10 different university people over the past week. They've all got different answers to this question, but I'll ask it anyway. Is semester 2 a complete write-off?
Good. That's a nice easy one for me. So thanks for that. Look, I'm definitely an optimist. So I wouldn't say it's a write-off at all, but I would say that it's looking difficult and it's looking really, really challenging. And I guess in terms of the way that we're approaching that, and I kind of touched upon this at the start of the webinar, is when this crisis started off, we essentially put together a new plan for the year in terms of what can we impact in the here and now and the soon. And we've approached the year by, okay, what can we do now? What do we do soon? And what's for later? So a really quite simplistic way of, when there's so much uncertainty, what do we feel we can impact now? And how do we put all our efforts into activities such as that? So part of the conversation has been about so before I answer it in full, is it a write-off? It's also been about what's the message. So what can we realistically go to market with at the moment? So if we've got campaigns going out in China or India or Vietnam, realistically, what can we tell students, considering there's travel bans in place? So, so even just starting a fresh conversation around, okay, what do we need to say in market? So for us, as a university, we go back to what are the core pillars of our brand, essentially. So for us, it's about making sure that students are aware that, in a way, that what we're dealing with at the moment is the new norm. And how do we make students feel comfortable in terms of not necessarily putting off their career? So there is a lot of uncertainty, but that's not specific to Australia. So how do we gently encourage students to essentially not put off their study for 6 months or 12 months, but continue to follow their study journey? But I guess it's an opportunity for us to look at more flexible ways that we can offer that to our students. So yeah, part of our approach has been, well, what can we offer that's different to what we normally offer? And again, how do we, if semester 2 is going to look very different, and if it is going to continue to be really challenging, again, making sure that the initiatives that we've got in place are long-term enough so that they can help us build that pipeline for semester 1 2021. But I guess as well, our recruitment team is also looking at different and new online student recruitment tools. So no, I wouldn't say it's a write-off, but I guess every week that goes by and the way things are, it does look more and more challenging. One thing that does reassure me at times, not necessarily for semester 2, but just generally, is we are still seeing engagement from prospective students. We're still seeing a lot of engagement from our agent network as well. So while we're doing things differently and looking at different propositions, the BAU remains, which is building that pipeline. So no, definitely haven't given up yet on semester 2.
Well, it does.
Might just
sure.
Jump in there. Sorry, just I think that point about continuity is a really important one, because we focused a lot of today, or I probably have, on those students at risk, and that's obviously the priority at the moment. There's also that cohort of students who are able to continue their studies, be it online or whatever. It's really important for those students that they maintain all of the sort of work that they're doing in terms of that extracurricular side of things. I mean, just one example, we have these annual partner projects, which we do with people can apply in a competitive grants program. One of the successful ones this year was with Outcome Life to deliver a series of employability seminars, and it's the second year that's run, and they're incredibly popular. And obviously the key component in that is the stuff that happens in the face-to-face networking over drinks and canapes afterwards, where they sort of get to understand and learn about that sort of the hidden skills of the job market in Australia. So yeah, I mean, Outcome Life have been great. They've adapted because they're not doing the face-to-face stuff. They've invested heavily in technology to be able to sort of replicate that interaction the best way they can. So again, it's important for students. They're going to be isolated. They need to be able to tap into these initiatives to get them connected with other students, not only international students, but other domestic students. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us, whether you're in a university, state government funding programs or whatever, to use our imagination, our creativity, and connect people during this time.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I can see Liz Griffin's here from ACU, and she's actually asked you, Peter, do you think there's going to be any support that Study New South Wales and other state-based bodies could lend to the message that online learning is not an inferior product, especially in relation to the increased perception that discounts should be offered to students? I think that's fascinating. I mean, we looked right now. I mean, IDP is currently in a trading halt after dropping 27% in a single week. Agents, the role of agents is being thrown up in the air, and it also raises the question whether students will register with an overseas provider to take an online course. It's so many. It's mind-boggling to think we're in this position. A month from, it's just insane. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, Liz. And look, I think we've had some great leadership from Rebecca Hall at the federal level, who's getting us all to coalesce around these sorts of messaging. I suppose it's a question of timing and sequencing. Maybe right now is not the time to go hard on that, because I think there's this, high degree of sensitivity around those students that are significantly impacted. So I think rightly so, the focus of messaging at the moment is around how, what services are there for students to access, how do they access, and so on. But I think that's a really good point. I think we need to very quickly shift to that. I mean, I think this whole situation has thrown into question a range of things that we do. I mean, just look at the amount of international travel that occurs. Is that actually necessary? Here we are communicating with how many 200 and whatever people perfectly well, sitting in, our own living rooms or wherever, trying to sort of get on with our families and reintroduce ourselves to them and do our jobs at the same time. I think there's a whole bunch of things that we need to. But look, I think that's something that's certainly there's a strong awareness of, and we're all looking at how we move to that.
Yeah, I mean, Tom, obviously, you are trying to develop that product for the future. How does that look? I mean, are we in a short-term change, or are we looking at a fundamental change in the way that people interact from now on?
Yeah, sure. Before I answer that, I might just also touch on Liz's question as well, which is a really good one about what support can be offered in terms of the message around online learning. And that's something that we've tried to address as well, in that, a lot of universities have just suddenly gone out to students and said, oh, we're now moving online. And for us, what we're trying to do is, what's the story around that? So what does online actually look like for a student? So what does it look like for a parent? So I think there is a broader piece of work there that needs to happen in terms of pushing the value of online. And then, James, in terms of your point around
the existential crisis that we're now facing as a human race.
What does the future look like? I think I think that's a really hard one. I think a lot of universities are really in the here and now in terms of getting through the immediate. I think there will always be a need or a desire, particularly in the short to medium term, for that global experience. I think that might look different, particularly, in China, where there's, some high-ranked universities teaching in English. So will that look like the way that it looks now, or will students want a shorter experience? I think that's possible. I think, I'm sure most universities over the coming months will see more interest in some of those health type programs. I know we're already seeing that. So I think for some of those programs that we can't deliver online for, I think they will continue. But I don't think that we will just come out the other side and go back to business as usual. I really think
I don't think so either.
Things will change. I think students' appetite for online will be different. So I think as a university, or as universities, we've got to be more flexible in terms of where we deliver, how we deliver, and not probably the big blocks of learning that we currently offer. So I think the demand from students will be different. And I think, even in this crisis, we've seen government amend policy. We've seen amendments around the work piece, and I'm sure other things will happen as a result of this. So I think as government policy possibly moves, I think as students get more comfortable with online, I think universities will have to follow. And I think Peter's point about travel, I think travel will still form a component of what we do, but it won't be just an automatic decision. I think we'll have other tools that we're more comfortable with, that we can start to see their value as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because of the cyclical nature of this business. I mean, there are other businesses, retail, tourism, trade, things like that have this, the sort of at the coalface in terms of, they're the first ones to close or suffer consequences. We know sort of when we got to be in market for that outcome to come. It's so difficult. Even my own business, it's hard to plan, and so many businesses around Australia are in the same situation. So, yeah, I think the next 12 months will be super interesting. I think one of the most frustrating things is the fact that we don't know when it will end. I mean, if you watch the news, they say, well, basically we're like this until there's a vaccine or there's enough testing that everyone can sort of have some movement again. No idea. So in terms of these big multi-million-dollar organizations, how do you plan? So look, we're almost at the end of the webinar. I'd love to have a look at some questions. Yeah, I mean, some of these have already been asked. Peter or Tom, if you see any that you'd like to jump in. Oh, Gary Lee's here from City of Melbourne. Good stuff. Thanks, Gary. Yeah, and yeah, okay, yeah, a lot of these have been answered already. Cool. Craig Carragher from SCAPE, I believe is the chairman of SCAPE. What is the prospect of TEXA requiring second semester in-country face-to-face or even onshore learning, onshore learning? The government policy will be as important as university capacity re online learning and also online offshore learning. Our universities are not proven competitors in the open learning, online learning space. So there will be enormous competition. Then there'll be an opportunity for our state study groups. Do you guys have anything like to mention about that?
Look, I might have to take it on notice. I mean, I know that the regulators, like everyone else, has just been playing catch up. They're trying to be as flexible as they can to support the sector. I think it's been a situation of the whole of the federal government and state governments have been completely focused on the sort of stimulus and well, firstly the health response and then the stimulus response, simultaneously. I think all of these issues are now coming out, and we're going to have to sort of work through them. The good thing is we have mechanisms through the task force and others where we can raise those. So I'm not sure if that one's already been raised, but I'm happy to take that on notice and take that one forward.
Tom?
Sorry, I'm actually just looking at. I was actually just looking at another question.
Yeah,
James.
sure. No, feel free. We're in Q&A mode now.
Yeah,
So
I was just looking at a question which asks what solutions are RMIT or the sector looking at to solve the potential issues that the closing of English testing facilities in major source countries may pose? That's a really good question. It's an issue that we've been looking at and working through, but we definitely haven't got a solution yet. We know that I think TOEFL are planning to offer online testing relatively quickly. We hope. But yeah, we're working through a variety of different options there, but we definitely haven't reached a consensus yet. But yeah, that's going to be a big challenge for us and a number of universities as well.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to remember that Tom and Peter are here in good faith, just trying to address what they know, and there's a lot of unknown. And as we sort of move through this together, things are changing almost every day. So Rafaela has asked, surely there is a tremendous potential for the sector to send the message in coming months that once borders reopen and planes start flying again, there will be an enormous backlog of demand for places. Imagine trying to get a table at a restaurant once the lockdowns are eased. Is this an angle for the reputation task force? I mean, I would extend that to universities as well. I mean, that is a great point. I mean, there is going to be pent up energy here that needs to be unleashed on the sector.
Yeah, I think, that's something that we're really conscious of. And I've kind of touched upon this, but, when we're looking at our recruitment activities for the remainder of the year, there is no doubt uncertainty about semester 2. But as you've said, this isn't an issue that's facing Australia. It's facing almost every country in the world, so that we know that students who are considering Australia, the UK, Canada, US, and other countries, at the moment, they're pretty much unable to travel. So what we've got to do is make sure that when that time comes, when students can travel, that we're first choice. There's obviously a timing element there, but I think that's really important, that we send a really strong message to students that we look after their students, so that we do a really good job over these next few months of making sure students are supported and have a positive experience. And then when things change, which they of course will, that we're ready to play a big part in promoting Australia to those students.
That's right. I think, Peter, you'll have something to say on that, because from a study body perspective, a positive student experience is the ultimate marketing tool, and they will remember. International students, as you said at the start, international students will remember if this sector let them down during this crisis and didn't help out, didn't fight for them. It's great to see the governments working hand in hand with each other, universities trying to get things moving. Obviously, they're quasi-government institutions as well, so it's not easy. Peter, did you have anything to mention on that just before we sort of close it all up?
Sorry, James. I was just also responding to some questions.
Oh, good.
Just typing answers in. Yes. Look, I mean, I think in times of downturn, people always go back to education. There's going to be a global downturn where industries will have shed hundreds of thousands of workers. People will be in a desperate need to retrain, repivot. Maybe the sectors they're in have been disrupted. I think there'll be a period where people will be gun shy around international travel. I'm sure that's going to be the case, but it's impossible to put a value on the experience that someone gets through that completely immersive experience of going to another country, living there a long time, developing a language skills, learning a new culture. That's not going to go away. We're human individuals. I think there'll be some positives in terms of the way we mix up that experience and I think this is a great opportunity for us to get better at online delivery and making those kind of virtual distance options more real and interactive, and factoring in the student experience into that. So I think without a doubt, I'm not sure if that answers it. I was sort of a bit distracted typing some of those responses, but
no, I was just curious to hear about this sort of pent up demand. I think New South Wales has an opportunity to bounce back in February 2021 with something really interesting and different. We have to remember this is a temporary problem. Hopefully it's shorter than 18 months and we can get it done in 12, but who knows? It's up to the health professionals, I guess. So I have talking about the health professionals. Insider Guides is not a health professional by any means, but we have spent a lot of time. I've worked with our team to put together a whole bunch of COVID-19 resources for international students. We've been working with Austrade really closely on creating really interesting content about nutrition, about mental health, about things to do in isolation, about other international students that are being innovative and resilient, and we'll continue to produce that content. I've just put it in the hub here. In the comments is a link to our COVID-19 resource hub, and we've also got links to all the other all of the major news sources as it comes in. So we're a small team, but we're trying to make sure that international students have content from around the internet that just relates just to them, including information from all the different study bodies as well, which we'll be updating as we go. Look, I think I'd love to just probably round it out there and say, look, thank you so much for everybody for joining us today. We will be doing these every week, as I said, and please do connect with me if you want your questions or have different concepts you'd like to be addressed. Obviously, this is a moving feast, and Peter said the goalposts are moving all the time. After this, you'll receive a survey, which will just ask you a few questions about the webinar. We're trying to improve it, and we're all trying to adjust to the new normal here. And so I really appreciate everyone's efforts. It is not an easy time for anyone. I will record this and I will put it on our website and I'll send it out to everyone who has subscribed here, and any resources that Tom or Peter want me to include, I'll put them in that link as well. And so you'll have all that by tomorrow evening.
And any questions we didn't answer, James, maybe I've just been trying to follow it on the chat, but there's some I may not have got to, so just let us know and we can respond to those separately.
Yeah, no worries. And I'll get a report of all the different questions. That's the beautiful thing about technology, is that I'll get a lovely report of all the questions that were answered, all the ones that were not, and I'll send those around, and hopefully we can get you some answers. Cool. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for all your help. And Peter and Tom, in such a difficult time, giving your time up to do this webinar is unbelievably lovely of you for doing that. And feel free to reach out if you guys ever want any questions asked.
Good on you, James. Thanks for organising it. It's a great initiative.
Thank you. Cheers.
Yeah, I'll echo that. Thanks, James.
Thanks, Tom, as well.
Yeah, thanks, Peter.
Thanks, everybody. See you soon. Bye.
Rightio. Bye now. Bye.